So I mentioned here and there that I think Total Drama Revenge of the Island should have had a follow-up season with the same cast instead of jumping straight into All-Stars, so this video is that. As usual, I want to start at the end and work my way back to the beginning, so the first character I want to highlight is Jo. She won't quite make it to the finale, but as someone smart, strong, and indifferent to the feelings of others, she's naturally this season's main villain. Her heroic foil, Brick, will obviously make it to the finale instead of Jo, but unlike previous videos, I'll keep the other finalists a secret. For now, I'll just skip to the teams, starting with Jo and Brick, who will once again be forced to cooperate on Team X. I'll add Cameron and Lightning to their team to maximize tension with Jo, but there'll also be lingering tension between Cameron and Lightning from the previous season. For similar reasons, Scott will be grouped with the remaining post-merge contestants, Mike and Zoey, on Team Y. However, I'll also toss B and Dawn into the mix, that way Scott is forced to confront all the people he's previously wronged. This gives both teams a consistent source of conflict for the first few episodes, but just to ensure that Mike and Zoey aren't too comfortable either, I also want to add Anne Maria to their team so I can explore the aftermath of their love triangle. With that, half the female characters are already on Team Y, so I'll put Stacy and Dakota onto Team X, but that leaves Sam as the last contestant, and although I could place him with his girlfriend, I want to put him on Team Y for the sake of some early drama. Speaking of which, Episode 1. Like any other season opener, Episode 1 serves to assemble each team and establish their group dynamics. In the case of Team Y, B and Dawn work together to come up with a plan, Mike and Zoey rely on each other in Cameron's absence, which annoys Anne Maria, Sam tries to reassure Dakota that their separation will only be temporary, and Scott is forced to do most of the hard work in this challenge due to his bad reputation, attracting a lot of pain in the process. As for Team X, Cameron remains optimistic despite being separated from his friends and grouped with his enemies. Brick tries to bring the team to a consensus as Lightning and Jo bicker over who should be in charge. Stacy is determined to impress everyone with new skills that she clearly hasn't developed yet, all while Dakota struggles with being separated from the one person on this island who understands her. Aside from that, the rest of the episode will be fairly standard. At some point, Mike will purposely trigger Svetlana to show his improved relationship with his alters, but eventually, Team X injures Sam, so Dakota goes on a rampage against her own team and is eliminated for it. Some people might object to eliminating such a strong character first, but from a character perspective, I couldn't justify keeping her for longer since she doesn't have anyone to interact with other than Sam. It's not like she had a good track record to begin with, given that she was eliminated almost immediately both times she competed, and ultimately, since the show is what caused her mutation in the first place, it's probably healthier for her to leave anyway. Episode 2. Despite just losing his girlfriend, Sam handles Dakota's departure relatively well. As the only other couple on the island, Mike and Zoey offer their condolences, but like last season, Sam is also just comfortable on his own. The rest of his team tries to be supportive as well, but his lax attitude toward losing Dakota annoys Anne Maria since her own relationship with Vito is currently on hold. As for Team X, once Chris announces today's more intellectual challenge, Cameron steps up to lead them. Lightning is hesitant to listen to him at first, but after Brick points out how much it would piss off Jo, he decides to give Cameron a chance. This pays off as Team X goes on to win the challenge, but Team Y doesn't go down without a fight. Firstly because they have their own resourceful genius in B, but also because Mike allows Manitoba to front for this challenge, so he can apply his keen observation and navigational skills. Incidentally, these same skills overlap heavily with Zoe's commando persona, so she contributes a lot to Team Y's efforts as well, and as a result, she and Manitoba bond to the point that Anne Maria becomes jealous of their relationship too. It doesn't help that after Scott tries to sabotage Zoey, Manitoba encourages her to retaliate against him, which strengthens their bond. But after consulting with Dawn about the future of her love life later in the episode, Anne Maria is inspired to pursue Vito once more. In any case, Team Y manages to keep up with Team X for most of the challenge by using their combined talents, but eventually Sam's injury from the previous episode takes a toll on their progress. Team Y slows down right as Stacy is trying her damnedest not to be the weakest link on her team, so when Team Y loses, they eliminate Sam. Like Dakota, I chose to eliminate Sam early due to his limited narrative potential, but logically it also just made sense since he's one of the weakest competitors. I mean, at the beginning of Revenge of the Island, he was the second to last person to make it to the woods, only beating Stacy. In episodes 3 and 5, he didn't even participate because he was literally incapacitated, and overall, he only seemed to get as far as he did because Scott prioritized B and Dawn as bigger threats. Based on his All-Stars performance, it doesn't even seem like he'd form any new relationships, so it'd be truly hard to justify keeping him around any longer than this. Episode 3. After such an intense day of working against each other, Episode 3 begins with Mike, Zoey, and Cameron eating breakfast together. Mike and Zoey commend Cameron's leadership skills from yesterday, and as B joins their table, Cameron goes on to compliment his genius until Jo interrupts their conversation. She doesn't like how friendly Cameron is with the enemy team, and neither does Lightning, but Brick maintains the peace until Chris calls for challenge time. The challenge itself will involve animals so that Dawn has something to do, but besides that, the episode will mostly just focus on character interactions. In Anne-Maria's case, she tries to make moves on Mike, hoping to get through to Vito, but instead she only annoys him into becoming Chester. Chester himself mainly complains about B's modern inventions. Cameron continues to compliment B, which raises suspicion among his teammates, and Brick continuously intervenes to keep Team X from tearing itself apart. This last point is a huge problem for Scott since he's undeniably the most hated member of Team Y and therefore the player most likely to go home if they lose, so in order to save himself, Scott sabotages the opposition for once. He succeeds in stopping Team X, injuring Lightning and almost hurting Stacy in the process, though luckily Joe is there to save her. However, he also harms one of the animals from the challenge, which makes Dawn very mad at him. In any case, since Team X can't properly direct their grievances towards Scott, Joe uses this opportunity to direct their votes elsewhere. By exploiting Lightning's pre-existing skepticism, as well as Stacy's gratitude for saving her, Joe is able to convince them that Cameron is to blame for their failure, so the team votes 3-2, and Cameron is eliminated. In universe, this is just the smartest move for Joe to make, since Cameron sabotaged her last season and quickly gained a lot of power in this season, but out of universe, Cameron's early elimination mainly serves to give other characters room to grow, since his own arc is already complete, similar to Sammy in my pitch for Pahkitewa Island Season 2. Episode 4. Since Scott undermined Mike and Zoey's best friend, destroyed B's budding relationship with Cameron, and injured an innocent animal in Dawn's care, the entirety of Team Y is justifiably pissed off at him. Zoey spearheads the movement to get him off the island, so Scott spends most of this episode working desperately to avoid elimination. By contrast, things on Team X are a bit more low-key, with Stacy offering her allyship to Joe and Brick filling the power vacuum left by Cameron. In the case of the former, Joe declines Stacy's offer as she doesn't want to be weighed down by her utter uselessness, but in the case of the latter, Brick swiftly establishes a good relationship with Lightning that Joe struggles to get a handle on due to their distrust of her. It's only after Stacy compliments Brick's leadership that Joe begins to reconsider her offer because Stacy's blatant preference for Brick over Lightning destabilizes their relationship at a speed that Joe could only dream of. Meanwhile, on Team Y, Scott continues to dig his own grave as every one of his attempts to help his team win leads to worse and worse outcomes. Eventually, Scott triggers Vito as a last resort to stir drama between Zoey and Anne-Maria, but his plan backfires when he insults the latter and Vito steps in to defend her honor. This whole debacle results in Team Y losing, and while Anne-Maria is thankful for Vito's return, she's disappointed by the brevity of their reunion, and since the end of it was triggered by Scott insulting her, Anne-Maria joins the rest of her team and votes against Scott. I feel like Team Y's obsessive hatred of Scott could come off as mean-spirited, but allowing all his previous victims to eliminate him in one fell swoop seemed like the most emotionally satisfying and narratively convenient way to dispose of him. He's already been on a team with every other character besides Joe, which means he's had a chance to interact with pretty much everyone, so eliminating him now to make room for other characters, and particularly the ones he sabotaged last season, just made sense to me. Episode 5. With Scott gone and Team X's leadership unstable, Episode 5 will function as a transition for both teams. In the case of Team X, Joe will accept Stacy's offer of allyship from the previous episode. Meanwhile, Team Y will shift even more focus toward Anne-Maria's love life. In the latter case, this starts when Anne-Maria rips Mike's shirt off and successfully triggers Vito after watching Scott do it. Unlike the previous episode, Anne-Maria actually gets to interact with Vito this time, but remarkably early into the challenge, Team Y is split in half with B, Dawn, and Anne-Maria on one side, and Vito and Zoey on the other. Clearly this is frustrating for Anne-Maria, so she rants to B and Dawn about it throughout the episode. However, while Zoey and Vito are initially at odds with each other, they gradually overcome their differences as Zoey's own aggressive tendencies bubble to the surface. As for Team X, Joe and Stacy continue to divide their team by favoring Brick's leadership over Lightning's. Throughout the episode, Brick tries to call out Joe's suspicious heel-face turn, but Lightning refuses to believe him since she's, literally just doing everything Brick says. This eventually comes to a head when Dawn's party runs into Team X, and with the help of the animals she befriended in Episode 3, she manages to take down all of them except for Lightning. Brick asks Lightning to save them, but he chooses to move forward instead, only to be intercepted by Vito and Zoey. Vito chooses to hold him off while Zoey wins the game for Team Y, so the remainder of Team X is primed to eliminate Lightning by the end of the challenge. However, as a surprise to both Team X and Y, rather than kicking Lightning off, Chris instead chooses to swap Team X's worst player with Team Y's most valuable player, Zoey. Naturally, this heightens the tension on both teams, as now the only remaining couple is split up, while the strongest player in the game has a grudge against the entirety of Team X. However, it also leaves Mike in the crossfire of Vito's love life, since Anne-Maria is not happy about Vito's friendship with Zoey. This is mainly because she really only wants Vito, so when even he is susceptible to Zoey's charm, Anne-Maria understandably feels a lot less secure about their relationship. Additionally, since he cost Lightning the game and almost got him eliminated, Mike must also deal with his new grudge against Vito. Meanwhile, Brick and Joe must compete for Zoey's allyship, otherwise they run the risk of being eliminated by each other. Episode 6. As lovers on opposite sides of a conflict, Episode 6 begins with Mike and Zoey meeting in secret to check in on each other. Mike explains that he's been hiding from Anne Maria because she's still mad at Vito for befriending Zoey. Meanwhile, Zoey shares how Joe has been smothering her with attention in hopes of gaining her support. Both of them try to laugh off the situation and plan to hold out until the merge until eventually Dawn and Stacy find them and return them to the cafeteria. There, their teammates are waiting, and while Mike avoids Anne Maria by hiding behind Bea and Dawn, Joe continues to kiss up to Zoey despite her clearly not buying it. Thankfully, Brick eventually steps in to protect Zoey from Joe's harassment, and very quickly they establish a more organic connection that Joe could only ever hope to form. And so, during the challenge, Joe and Stacy attempt to undermine Brick and Zoey's new alliance as they proceed to get along effortlessly. Meanwhile, Team Y tries to keep up with Lightning's demands as he finally ascends to the position of team leader. Admittedly, he's really good in the role, at least, good enough for his teammates to go along with it. However, his arrogant attitude doesn't exactly make him popular. So when Mike triggers Svetlana halfway through the challenge and garners much of the praise Lightning was hoping for, Lightning is less than pleased to be upstaged by yet another one of Mike's alters. As the episode continues, Joe becomes more and more desperate until she eventually comes up with a more elaborate plan to sabotage Brick and Zoey. She lays the groundwork for their downfall throughout the second half of the game, but when Stacy accidentally reveals Joe's plan, Brick and Zoey are furious with her. Her antics almost cost them the game, but luckily for Joe, Team Y is in danger during the climax, so Team X is able to finish the challenge first. The only member of Team Y not in danger is Dawn, but when faced with the choice of saving her team versus her animal friend from the last episode, she chooses the latter and gets eliminated for it. Now, I'm very aware that Dawn is a fan favorite, so I'm sure many of you are disappointed that she didn't go further or have much of an arc. However, I just want you to know that I tried really hard to keep her as long as possible. I even pushed her as far as episode 9 in some iterations of this season, but ultimately I decided to eliminate her here just because she doesn't have many relationships to develop or flaws to overcome. Exploiting her love of animals was really the best I could come up with, and while it's not the most climactic way to eliminate her, I'm kind of just hoping that Dawn fans are at least satisfied that she's going home for legitimate reasons this time as opposed to being sabotaged. Episode 7. As punishment for revealing her true intentions to Brick and Zoey, Episode 7 kicks off with Joe reprimanding Stacy and ordering her to shut up until the end of the day's challenge. Conveniently, today's challenge requires all the players to remain silent anyway, but the threat of Joe's disapproval adds an extra layer of tension to Stacy's struggle. Of course, with Stacy occupied, Joe continues to insist that Team X do what she says despite Brick and Zoey repeatedly shutting her down, but in the meantime, Brick and Zoey themselves essentially carry Team X using stealth tactics from their respective backgrounds. In a similar fashion, when Mike allows Manitoba to front again, he applies his own observation and survival skills to make sure Team Y stays undetected. It helps that their team already has the quietest character on the show, in B. However, Manitoba still brings an element of chaos to Team Y as he challenges Lightning's authority and flirts with Anne Maria. In the former case, Lightning repeatedly tries to reassert his dominance over Manitoba only to fail each time, and in the latter case, Anne Maria feels conflicted since she's getting hit on, just not by the person she wants. Overall, it's a confusing time for both teams, especially now that Manitoba and Zoey are competing against each other. However, as Team Y approaches the finish line, Manitoba loses his hat and reverts back to Mike, completely blowing his cover in the process. This leaves him utterly defenseless, but right when Mike is about to get hurt, Zoey sacrifices herself to ensure his safety. Unfortunately for Team X, this reveals all but Stacy's location as she manages to stay quiet the whole time. However, it's not long before Joe compromises Team Y's position by making B shout, either through pain or a previously established phobia. This creates an opportunity for Stacy to win, and so although B stayed silent for the majority of the episode, he's still sent home since he's ultimately the one that got Team Y caught. Honestly, it's not that fair, but the doyleist reason I'm eliminating B now is simply that he's run out of characters to interact with. Despite being an exceptionally resourceful and level-headed player, B's resistance to verbal communication essentially creates a barrier between him and the other characters, and that severely limits his ability to build complex relationships that the audience can invest in. Of course, I could have given him the ability to speak, but doing so felt inauthentic to his character since B's silence is always framed as more of a neutral trait than a flaw that needs to be overcome. I do feel kind of bad for sabotaging B again instead of finding a more character-specific way to eliminate him, but like Dawn, he just doesn't have many flaws that can be exploited for drama.
Just look at his aura!
Episode 8. As Stacy continues to ride the high of leading her team to victory, Zoey expresses her regret over nearly costing Team X the game yesterday. Jo simply agrees that Zoey should feel guilty, but Brick reassures her that saving her boyfriend from danger was the right thing to do. By contrast, Lightning and Maria scold Mike for causing them so much trouble both as Manitoba and as himself, so together they threaten to vote him off next if they lose. During the challenge, Lightning and Maria continue to pressure Mike, but very quickly their shared frustration over him transforms into general banter as they end up having a lot in common. Likewise, Zoey begins to bond with Stacy as a fellow small-town girl, and during their conversations, they actually dig into some of Stacy's insecurities and explore why she's so desperate to prove herself in the first place. Whether she admits to fabricating her family's achievements or not isn't really important. What matters is that Zoey's own experience overcoming her insecurities inspires Stacy to be less reliant on Jo. In the meantime, once Team Y crosses the halfway point, something causes Lightning to accidentally rip Mike's shirt and trigger Vito for the third time. Upon seeing Lightning and Maria get along, Vito becomes extremely jealous and fights Lightning for a bit, until eventually Team X starts to catch up to them. In order to slow down Team Y, Jo endangers Maria so that Vito will go to save her, but in retaliation, Lightning attacks Zoey in an attempt to even the playing field. This results in both Maria and Zoey being in danger at the same time. However, because Zoey's calls for help change Vito back into Mike, he ultimately goes to save her instead. This severely angers Maria, and since all this chaos causes Team Y to lose, she and Lightning fulfill their promise to eliminate Mike. However, it's worth noting that when Maria casts her vote, she does so with a mixture of rage and regret. This last detail is something I really want to highlight, because despite only showing up for like 3 episodes, Mike's time on the show was really about giving Vito and Maria closure more than anything else. I especially wanted to explore Maria's perspective since the writers basically wrote her out the moment they decided to advance Mike's character arc, but I felt her grief would be most palpable after choosing to let go of Vito herself. That's kind of why I had Vito abandon her in this episode as, like, her final straw. However, his unavailability throughout the season is really what pushes Maria to give up on him since, unlike Zoey, she's not interested in dealing with the rest of Mike's system. As for Mike himself, instead of giving him a new arc this season, I mostly just expanded on his previous arc by showing how his relationships have improved, both with his alters and with Zoey. In the case of his alters, he trusts them enough to let them front during challenges, which also gives them more chances to form new relationships. Meanwhile, Zoey proves that her love truly is unconditional, as her devotion to Mike persists regardless of which personality is active, or even which team he's on. She's completely willing to risk everything for him, as evidenced by the previous episode, which is why Mike repays her in this episode by sacrificing his own place at the game. You know, symbolically anyways. As far as I know, it's not like Vito can ignore her calls for help and prevent Mike from fronting again. However, I also just thought it'd be funny to invert Mike's previous elimination because throughout Revenge of the Island, he simply wanted to be Mike, but this time being Mike is kind of the problem. Episode 9. As there are only 6 characters remaining, Episode 9 begins with Chris merging the teams just so he can stitch them back together for the day's challenge. He pairs each contestant with a player they're least compatible with, so Jo is partnered with Brick, Stacy is with Lightning, and Zoey is with Maria. Chris then explains the rules for each section of this 4-part challenge, and while most of them aren't that important for the purposes of this video, he does highlight that both members of the winning team will gain immunity. This means that Jo can't get rid of Brick if she wins, but even despite that, she's still unambiguously the least popular player on the island, so she's still motivated to win. And so round 1 goes to her and Brick, while Zoey and Maria place 2nd, and Stacy and Lightning place 3rd. In Zoey and Maria's case, they just missed 1st place because Maria's grudge against Zoey for stealing her boyfriend makes her less cooperative. Meanwhile, Stacy and Lightning's utter lack of chemistry dragged them all the way to 3rd. Things are better for the duo in round 2, but only because Lightning single-handedly carries Stacy to victory. By contrast, the other teams each drop by 1 place, putting Jo and Brick at 2nd and Zoey and Maria at 3rd. So after the round is over, Lightning and Maria both vent to each other about how much they despise their partners. This prompts Zoey to reach out to Maria because if they don't get their act together now, they're gonna fall behind and both be at risk for elimination. So in round 3, Zoey makes it her mission to comfort Maria, reassuring her that she'll find someone besides Vito, and that rockets them straight to 1st place. In the meantime, Stacy and Lightning seethe over getting 2nd place, while Jo and Brick land in 3rd after Jo's dubious tactics in the previous round resulted in Brick monitoring her more closely. With the game tied, all teams are desperate to win, but none can afford to lose less than Jo, so she decides to frame Zoey for sabotaging her own team. She tells Maria beforehand that Zoey will betray her in the final round, so when Jo makes that happen, Maria immediately turns on her and they get into a huge fight. In the process, Zoey and Anne-Maria fling Stacy and Lightning all the way to last place. So when Joe and Brick win immunity, every single loser blames Zoey, and they vote her off. For Joe, this kills two birds with one stone, as she squashes Zoey and Anne-Maria's friendship before it even begins, while eliminating Brick's greatest ally. However, Zoey's elimination is also useful for me because it helps to generate more tension between Brick and Joe. That's not to say that Zoey's development isn't important on its own, it's just that, like Mike, it's mostly an extension of her arc from last season where she made friends and learned to embrace her aggressive side. That development mostly carries into this season in the form of Zoey befriending her teammates and letting her temper slip on occasion. However, I did try to decouple her commando skills from her anger so she felt like a more well-rounded person. This makes her an extremely difficult character to eliminate under most circumstances, but there were just enough hostile characters in this episode that now was really the best time to do it. Episode 10. Although there are 5 characters left, there are basically only 2 plotlines for episode 10. The battle for Stacy's allyship, and Lightning and Anne-Maria's relationship speedrun. In the case of Lightning and Anne-Maria, they basically find themselves in forced proximity and then very quickly develop feelings for each other. Lightning is attracted to Anne-Maria's determination and confidence now that she's unburdened by her ex. Meanwhile, Anne-Maria is attracted to Lightning's dumb jock persona and overall reliability as a partner compared to Vito. I like the idea of a joke where one of them suggests a stupid idea and then the other one calls them a genius. So basically I want them to be a slightly meaner version of Lindsay and Tyler. By contrast, Joe and Brick find themselves competing for Stacy's allyship so they can sway the votes, but neither of them really succeeds. Instead, Joe just annoys everyone and completely fumbles the challenge, while Stacy discovers a hidden talent that helps her win the whole game. As a result, everyone plans to vote for Joe during the elimination ceremony, and yet, despite everything, Joe still manages to stay in the game just because Stacy quits the show to pursue her new talent. Naturally, this removes Joe's closest ally from the game, so now she and Brick must try even harder to make sure they win. However, I also just wanted Stacy to leave on a high note, other than the fact that she made it farther than she did in the last season. I know she's not the most popular character. Hell, I really only like the idea of her as a meme where her ancestors commit war crimes and stuff. But I've thought about eliminating Stacy earlier in previous iterations of this season, but none of them even came close to the absolute absurdity of Stacy being valued by another player, let alone 2. Episode 11. Now that Anne-Maria and Lightning are an item, Episode 11 essentially forces Joe and Brick to team up for the next challenge, which I imagine as some kind of long hike with a separate path for each duo. Lightning and Anne-Maria's relationship continues to accelerate to the point that they have their first kiss pretty early on in the episode. Meanwhile, Joe ditches Brick when he's in danger so she can get ahead. As the game continues, Lightning and Anne-Maria eventually get separated too, but they continue onward until Anne-Maria eventually finds and rescues Brick. This gives them some time to work together, but as all paths converge, Joe decides to endanger everyone to ensure that she wins. Brick manages to protect Anne-Maria, so they're both fine, but Lightning is either too injured to compete, or he's last in an auto-elimination challenge. Either way, Anne-Maria is pissed, and she's determined to turn that fury back onto Joe. It's basically the same formula I've used for the last 2 episodes where I eliminate someone's closest ally for drama. However, I also just felt the need to eliminate Lightning now before he got to the final 3. Obviously, there's no rule saying previous finalists can't participate in another finale, but since it would feel narratively redundant if he did, I didn't want his existence to point toward the other 2 players making it to the end instead. Episode 12. Since you guys already know that Joe isn't making it to the finale, I'll keep this episode's description brief. Basically, Brick and Anne-Maria team up against Joe, Brick wins the game, and Anne-Maria either sabotages or abandons Joe when she's in danger as revenge for hurting Lightning. The end. I apologize for the lack of fanfare, but at this point there's not much of a reason to dramatize the plot when I already made Joe's fate clear in the introduction. So instead I'll use the remainder of this section to explain why I chose to forego the obvious Brick vs. Joe matchup in favor of Brick vs. Anne-Maria. Firstly, Joe is a very prideful person. She believes she's better, stronger, and smarter than the competition, so losing to someone who's ostensibly less qualified like Anne-Maria is probably the worst punishment she could receive. Second, most total drama villains don't make it to the final 2 anyway, presumably to bruise their egos and to bar them from having an alternate ending. There are certainly exceptions to this, but every exception comes with a caveat, or in the case of the reboot seasons, they simply don't have alternate endings. Third, Brick vs. Joe just has a very predictable outcome, so it's not as interesting as a final matchup. Even if Joe had an alternate ending where she won, it'd have to come with some kind of condition so she doesn't get off scot-free. However, in that case, it also can't be too punishing, or else it will negate the point of making an alternate ending to begin with. Each ending kind of needs to be roughly equivalent, hence why Heather loses her money in World Tour, and Mike replaces Mal in All-Stars regardless of the ending. The only villain that comes close to winning without consequence is Lightning, but since he's more of a final boss than like a long-term antagonist, he has a much shorter list of sins to answer for than Scott or Joe. And since Cameron's main takeaway in both endings is that he can survive anything, it doesn't really change much if he loses. By contrast, Brick would have a very different experience if Joe won, and vice versa. So regardless of whether we're talking about like the single winner or alternate ending model, I don't think it'd work either way for these specific characters. Episode 13. Again, since the details of the finale aren't that important at this point, I'll just skip to the reasons that I wanted Brick and Anne-Maria to be this season's finalists. In Brick's case, he's smart, strong, and morally upstanding, which simply makes him easy to root for. Especially after getting eliminated by Joe last season, it just made sense for him to beat her this time, so winning the whole game would just be his victory lap. By contrast, Anne-Maria is a far less conventional protagonist. She doesn't have any discernible skills or even a particularly likable personality, so I'm mostly hoping that her raw determination and tenacity will make her compelling to watch. Admittedly, a lot of my drive to make Anne-Maria the secondary protagonist just came from a desire to give her a better romantic outcome, but once I realized it would basically take the entire season to dismantle and rebuild her love life anyway, slotting her into the finale became extremely easy. Compare this to Zoey, who I also considered making a finalist. She's arguably more qualified for the role based on her previous rank, friendliness, and commando skills which more neatly parallel Brick's own military experience, but I really couldn't think of anything for her to do in the lead up to the finale besides team up with Brick and take down Joe, which, would have made the penultimate challenge way too easy anyway. Developing Anne-Maria was just way more interesting, and since she was also low-key robbed last season over a misunderstanding, it felt more rewarding to give her a second chance at the million than if I had given that chance to Zoey or Joe. With that being said, I still have to account for the possibility of Anne-Maria losing, but thankfully she can at least leave with a stable relationship this time. It helps that Lightning is potentially a millionaire, but even in the case that he's not, he's still in proximity to wealth and fame through his dad, and I'm sure Anne-Maria will love that. As for Brick, while he doesn't have any consolation prize in the event that he loses, he'll likely take the loss in stride since he already beat his main rival. Missed opportunities. Although I'm fairly confident with most of my decisions for this story, there are naturally a lot of concepts that I scrapped from this version of the season that I wanted to highlight before closing out the video. A lot of them are just relationships that I kept short for the sake of pacing, like Sam and Dakota, Cameron and Bea, and Team Y versus Scott. However, as this season's main couple, the relationship most in need of screen time is arguably Lightning and Anne-Maria's. In my defense, Anne-Maria's relationship with Vito developed at a similarly breakneck pace, but at the same time, it did cross my mind that they could have just been teammates from the start. Likewise, it occurred to me that Anne-Maria and Zoey could have fully reconciled their differences as former romantic rivals, but I ultimately decided against it because it just didn't really feel necessary. Unlike Courtney and Gwen, who were at least friends for a day before becoming romantic rivals, Anne-Maria and Zoey have no such history, and just because they stopped fighting over the same guy doesn't mean they need to be friends. Keeping their dynamic messy at the end of the season also just felt more interesting and organic, at least to me, but also logistically, you never want too many characters to be friends because it makes them harder to eliminate in future installments, especially in a cast this small. As for Zoey herself, I initially considered making an origin story to justify her commando skills, but I gave up on the concept after struggling to find an in-universe reason to discuss it. In fairness, Zoey's commando persona isn't really intended to have an elaborate backstory since it mainly functions as a payoff to her thinning patience over the course of Revenge of the Island, but since it is attached to a skill set that isn't established nearly as well, I felt compelled to retroactively integrate these disparate character threads into something more cohesive. The backstory itself would just be that Zoey hid her aggressive side because it's what led her to be lonely and ostracized in the first place. Meanwhile, her commando skills would be explained throughout the season as an extension of her hobbies, like if she, applied her sewing skills to making traps or whatever. Granted, I could still incorporate these elements into the season as it is now, there just isn't a specific moment where explaining these details would add anything to Zoey's character. But that's enough about Zoey. Next, I want to talk about Scott, who, besides delaying his elimination, I also considered putting into an alliance with Joe. This is mostly because, ignoring All-Stars, she's the one character he hasn't been on a team with yet, so they haven't had that many chances to interact. However, they always seem to have some kind of adversarial tension in the few interactions they did have, so I wanted to capitalize on that by putting them on the same team. Knowing Joe, she'd probably weaponize Scott's poor reputation among Team Y to manipulate him, but ultimately I didn't want to overcomplicate a narrative that really only needed to last for 4 episodes. That's why I kept them separate, which, if anything, is more true to their original function as drama starters for their respective teams. Besides that, I only have a few ideas left. For one, I thought about giving Brick and Chef some kind of dynamic due to their military backgrounds, but the only episode where it'd be relevant is probably episode 7, so there's not much else to that. I wanted to give Mike a button-up shirt so he could switch with Vito more easily, but that detail also just never came up. At some point I considered eliminating Sam before Dakota, since he doesn't accomplish much either, but it's really hard to imagine the other characters treating her like a normal contestant for even one more episode, as if she isn't a gigantic mutant. At several points I swapped different characters around, usually B or Mike, since the team compositions weren't always the same in each iteration of the story. And finally, there was at least one attempt to make the season longer, since I know a lot of people don't like the shorter seasons. It was only about 20 episodes rather than a full 26, since it didn't seem reasonable to stretch a cast this small across that many episodes. But even then, the awkward elimination structure completely fucked up the pacing. I mean, I think I also eliminated Zoey early in this iteration of the season to see how Mike would function without her, and then later he would, bring her back to the show, only to get eliminated an episode later. Needless to say, I did not get very far with that version of the season, but it was useful in confirming my decision to keep things short. Future. Yeah, past that, I don't know where else the Revenge cast would go. Specifically when it comes to their villains, they've already used Scott and Joe, and since Lightning isn't that smart, there aren't many other candidates that can serve as a viable main antagonist for a third season. Granted, I could just reuse one of them like Julia, but it runs the risk of feeling repetitive, which is why I said moving on to a new cast was probably the best course of action in my Pagteo Island video. Failing that, Mal, or some variation on the concept, would be the only other option, and at that point their future would just be All-Stars all over again. Conveniently, that does coincide with my habit of taking characters from the middle of the season and making them finalists in the next season, but to be clear, I don't intend on making this video and my All-Stars video part of the same continuity, since All-Stars cast doesn't quite align with the outcome of this season. That being said, I do think most of the ideas from this video are applicable to my version of All-Stars, but specifically when it comes to fleshing out Mike and Zoey. For example, since Mike is partially responsible for ruining Vito and Anne-Marie's relationship in this season, it adds a lot more weight to Vito's arguments against Mike near the end of All-Stars. Meanwhile, Zoey's interactions throughout this season give her way more opportunities to normalize her commando skills and temper as a regular part of her personality, whereas All-Stars really just skipped that stage. Conclusion. So, that's a wrap on Season 2 with the Revenge cast. It's not exactly what I had in mind for my next video, but I hope I did it justice since Revenge is one of my favorite seasons, if not my favorite. I don't even know how long I've been thinking about this concept, but since the writing portion only took a month, I'm already much happier with this video from a production standpoint. It's mostly shorter because I tried not to over-explain things like in my Pagteo video, but it definitely helps that I didn't have to spend time justifying changes to an existing narrative since I was making a follow-up rather than a rewrite. Granted, you could still argue that this season is derivative since it lifts elements from my previous Total Drama videos like the structure of the Final Four and Zoey getting swapped, but it's completely original otherwise. Hopefully I can get this out soon, but in the meantime, don't give YouTube your personal information. Oh yeah, by the way, this is how I organized my ideas for this video. I don't think that comes up really well on camera. I initially wrote everything on the back of some receipts, these are some of the receipts that I wrote the episode stuff on. I also wrote some of the ideas in my notes app, but once I felt confident about the story, I finalized them onto this sheet of paper. It's folded into 16 sections, and basically each row is dedicated to one episode with major story beats in the left column and the out-of-universe reasons for eliminating the characters in the right column. Rather than ordering the story beats chronologically, events are arranged by characters, so it's the next loser is always at the top of the list while Brick and Anne-Maria occupy the bottom. However, I still tried to track the progression of both teams within each episode by putting numbers and letters next to each event. I think the last few boxes over here have leftover information like the team compositions and comparisons to my other Total Drama videos, but other than that it's pretty straightforward.